She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't look at me like that, unless you mean it." I still don't know if she was warning me, or asking me to stay. Where are you watching from, and what do you think this moment really meant? Tell me in the comments. It had been almost 10 years since I last walked into that house. Same familiar scent, polished wood, something floral, and time itself. The kind of stillness that holds memories in the walls. I wasn't planning to stay long, just to catch up with my old friend and share a drink before heading back to my quiet apartment across town. But she opened the door instead. For a second, I didn't recognize her. She wasn't the Mrs. Hahn I remembered, the gentle, reserved woman who used to set out snacks for us while we played video games. The years had softened her voice but sharpened her presence. Her hair was shorter now, a little wave at the ends, and her eyes carried the calm of someone who's seen enough to stop pretending. "Ah, you've grown," she said with a small laugh, even though I was clearly long past that. I smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to call her Mrs. Hahn or something else. "Good to see you again," I managed. Her voice had that tone, steady, low, warm, that could make even a simple greeting feel like a story. She led me to the living room. Afternoon light slipped through half-drawn curtains, painting the air gold. A tea set sat on the table, and she poured a cup for me before I could refuse. Her movements were quiet, practiced. When she looked up, I caught her gaze, only for a moment, and something shifted. It wasn't attraction. Not yet. Just recognition. The kind that reminds you that people don't stay frozen in your memory. They evolve, they shed versions of themselves, and sometimes what remains is more magnetic than before. We talked about simple things, where I'd been working, how her son was doing, how fast time had gone. But every pause between our words seemed to hum with something unspoken. Her eyes lingered on me when I spoke, and I found myself watching the way she smiled, small, measured, but sincere. When my friend came down the stairs, laughing and loud, it broke the spell. Suddenly I was aware again of where I was, who she was, and what shouldn't be felt in a single look. Later, as I left, she walked me to the door. The house was quiet again, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. I turned to thank her, and she said softly, "It's nice to see someone who remembers me from before." Before what? I almost asked, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, stepped out into the fading light, and told myself it was nothing. Just a glance. But as I walked to my car, I realized, some glances stay with you longer than they should. And hers was one of them. Dinner was louder than I remembered. My friend's laughter filled every corner of the room, the same boyish humor, the same unfiltered energy that once made us inseparable. We joked about old times, the kind that belonged to a simpler world, back when our worries ended with graduation and weekend plans. But while he spoke, my attention drifted toward her. She moved between the table and the kitchen, quietly tending to the small details. A new plate here, a folded napkin there. It wasn't just care. It was rhythm. The kind of grace people develop when they've lived through more than they ever talk about. Her voice carried over the conversation, low and warm. "Eat before it gets cold," she said with a small smile. I hadn't realized how long I'd been watching her. When she sat down across from me, her son's stories became background noise, like faint music under something far more interesting. She didn't speak much, but when she did, it was always directed at me. "So you've been traveling?" she asked. I nodded. "Mostly for work. It keeps me moving, maybe too much." She smiled. "Movement isn't always running away. Sometimes it's how we find peace." Her words lingered longer than they should have. I couldn't tell if she meant something deeper, or if I just wanted her to. The light flickered slightly, one of those old ceiling bulbs that never decide whether they're dying or just tired. The moment caught in that hesitation. Her eyes met mine. I looked away first. After dinner, my friend stepped outside to take a call, leaving the two of us alone. She began clearing the plates, and I instinctively stood to help. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I know," I replied, taking a plate from her hands anyway. Our fingers brushed, just lightly, but it was enough to pull the air tight between us. She didn't pull away immediately. For a second, we both stood there in that stillness, pretending to focus on the table, pretending the world hadn't shifted just slightly off balance. Then she smiled, that same polite, almost secret smile, and turned to the sink. "You've grown quieter," she said. "You used to talk so much." I chuckled. "Maybe I learned to listen." "To what?" she asked, glancing at me over her shoulder. "To what people don't say." Her gaze held mine longer than it should have. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence that followed. When my friend came back, it was like someone turned the lights back on. The spell broke again, laughter, chatter, the noise of comfort returned. But as I left that night, she followed me to the door. The hallway was dim. She stood close enough that I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, jasmine, and something warmer, maybe amber. She said, almost in a whisper, "It's nice to see someone who still looks at me." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just smiled, a quiet promise I didn't understand yet, and walked out into the night. But as I drove away, her words echoed in my head. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just remembering the past anymore. I was beginning to want something I wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to be a quick stop, a simple errand, nothing more. She'd lent me a book after dinner that night, something she said I might like. A story about people who wait too long to say what matters. It had been a week since then, and for some reason, I couldn't leave it unfinished. Maybe I just wanted a reason to see her again. When I pulled up to the house, the sky had already begun to dim. The air felt thick, heavy with that stillness right before a storm. I stepped out of the car just as the first drop hit the ground. She opened the door before I could knock. "You're early," she said, her voice carrying that same calm surprise. "I didn't know there was a schedule," I answered, holding up the book with a smile. She laughed softly, that low, melodic sound that felt warmer than it should. "You read fast." "I didn't want to keep it too long." "You could have," she said, stepping aside. "But I'm glad you didn't." The rain picked up outside, a soft patter at first, then a steady pour. She glanced toward the window, then back at me. "You'll get drenched if you go now," she said. "Stay until it passes." So I did. We stood on the porch together, watching the rain blur the garden into watercolor shapes. She handed me a mug of tea, the steam curling between us. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how something as ordinary as rain can make silence feel comfortable." I nodded. "Some silences are heavier than words." She turned toward me then, eyes reflecting the muted gray sky. The space between us felt impossibly small. I could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing beneath the rain. "You've changed," she said. "How so?" "You used to hide behind noise. Now you hide behind quiet." I smiled. "Maybe I learned it from you." Her laugh was soft, almost wistful. "Careful, you'll make me sound mysterious." "You already do," I said before I could stop myself. She looked at me, really looked, as though trying to decide whether to break the moment or let it breathe. For a heartbeat, the world outside disappeared. There was only the rain, her scent, the faint warmth of her shoulder near mine. Then thunder rolled in the distance, low and deep. She flinched slightly, and our eyes met again. This time, neither of us looked away. "You always had that look," she said softly, her tone somewhere between teasing and truth. "What look?" "Like you see too much." I didn't answer. Because she wasn't wrong. The rain kept falling, washing the air clean but leaving the tension untouched. When it finally slowed, I said I should go. She didn't stop me, only smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the edge of the door. "Next time," she said, "you don't need a book as an excuse." And somehow, that simple sentence carried more weight than anything she'd ever said before. I hadn't planned to stay. It was one of those visits that start with, "I'll just drop this off," and somehow stretch into hours. Her son had gone on a short trip, and she was home alone. She called earlier that day, asking if I knew how to fix a loose shelf in the hallway. I said I'd come by after work, thinking it'd be quick. By the time I arrived, evening had already settled. The air outside was cool, still damp from yesterday's rain. Inside, the lights were soft, a warm amber glow that made everything look like memory. She thanked me as I set down my tools. "You're saving me again," she said lightly. "Just trying to earn my tea," I teased. Her laugh filled the quiet house. "Then I suppose I owe you a good one." The job took longer than I expected. Maybe because I wasn't in a hurry. She sat nearby, reading while I worked, occasionally glancing up with that small, knowing smile. The silence between us was easy, but under it, something hummed. When I finished, she poured the tea. Jasmine again. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one I'd sat at years ago when her son and I were still kids, except now the air between us carried a kind of gravity that had nothing to do with the past. "You've always been good with your hands," she said, stirring her cup absent-mindedly. I smiled. "And you still find ways to make a compliment sound innocent." She raised her eyes, meeting mine across the table. "Who says it was?" The words hung there, delicate, dangerous. Neither of us laughed. Outside, the rain started again, light at first, then steadier, as if echoing what we couldn't say. We talked about everything and nothing. About her garden, the quietness of the neighborhood, how her son hardly called anymore. Her voice carried traces of loneliness she tried to disguise with grace. "I guess that's what happens," she said softly. "People build their own lives, and you start existing quietly in the background." I shook my head. "You were never the background." She looked at me then, really looked, and something in her expression changed. Her hand brushed mine as she reached for the teapot. Neither of us pulled away. The sound of rain filled the pause between us. My heart beat too loudly in that small kitchen. She drew a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't look at me like that." The silence stretched, trembling. "Unless you mean it." I didn't move. I didn't speak. The words landed somewhere deep, a question, a warning, and an invitation all at once. She withdrew her hand gently, her eyes soft but unreadable. "Finish your tea," she said. "It's getting cold." I did as she asked. But every sip tasted like something I'd already crossed and couldn't go back from. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door again. No words this time. Just a glance, one that felt like the beginning of something neither of us had the courage to name. Morning came too early. I hadn't slept much, not because of anything that happened, but because of everything that didn't. The night replayed in my head in fragments, the dim light, the sound of rain, her hand brushing mine, the way her voice trembled when she said, "Don't look at me like that, unless you mean it." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a mirror, one that showed me more of myself than I was ready to see. I kept telling myself it was nothing. That I'd imagined the tension, the shift in her tone, the faint warmth in her eyes that felt like an invitation. But lies, even soft ones, have weight. And by the time the sun rose, mine was heavy enough to feel real. I made coffee, but it tasted hollow. My mind wandered back to her kitchen, the smell of jasmine tea, the quiet rhythm of rain against glass. It was too vivid to be memory, it felt like I was still there. By noon, I found myself driving past her street. I didn't mean to, at least that's what I told myself, but sometimes the heart takes the long way around just to see what it shouldn't. Her car was in the driveway. Curtains half drawn. The same stillness as always. I didn't stop, but I slowed down enough to feel the pull, that quiet ache that comes from knowing someone's just a few steps away, but worlds apart. Later that afternoon, she called. Her voice was calm, casual. "Thank you for fixing the shelf," she said. "Any time," I answered, my tone steadier than I felt. There was a pause, soft, lingering. Then she added, "I hope you didn't misunderstand me last night." My breath caught. "No," I said, though part of me wished I had. "Good," she replied, relief flickering behind her composure. "I just wanted to be clear." But her voice cracked ever so slightly at the end, not from guilt, but from something gentler. Something she was trying to bury. After the call ended, the silence in my apartment felt louder than usual. I stared at my reflection in the window. For a moment, I didn't recognize the man looking back. He seemed younger. Restless. Someone who wanted something he shouldn't. That evening, I found the book she'd lent me still sitting on the table. I picked it up, flipping through the pages until I reached a line I'd underlined the first time I read it. Some people meet at the wrong time, and still make it feel right. I closed the book and leaned back, exhaling. Nothing happened that night. Not really. No touch that crossed the line, no words that couldn't be taken back. But the truth was simpler and heavier. Sometimes the quiet nights, the ones where nothing happens, are the ones that change everything. And that night, without a word spoken, she had changed something in me I didn't know could still move. A few weeks passed. Enough time, at least in theory, for things to return to normal. But nothing really did. We didn't talk much after that night. A few polite messages. A shared hello when I visited her son. Always careful. Always distant. And yet, in every pause between those moments, she was there. The echo of her voice, the weight of her gaze. Some people fade when they're gone. She didn't. She lingered, like a melody I couldn't stop humming under my breath. It was a Sunday when I saw her again. I hadn't planned it. I'd gone into a small bookstore downtown, one of those quiet places that still smelled like paper and rain, and there she was, standing in the corner aisle, running her fingers along the spines of the novels. For a second, I thought about leaving, pretending I hadn't seen her. But she turned before I could move, and our eyes met. Her smile came slowly, careful at first, then real. You still haunt bookstores, I see. And you still find the quietest corners, I said. We walked the aisles together, two people pretending to be casual, while everything unsaid sat between us like an open book neither dared to read. She stopped at a shelf, pulling out a familiar title, the same novel she'd once lent me. You ever finish it? She asked. I did, I said. Didn't like the ending. Why not? Because they walked away from each other, pretending it didn't mean anything. Her eyes flickered, a tiny movement, barely visible, but enough. And do you think it meant something? She asked quietly. I swallowed. I think it always does. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive. Heavy. Like every word we'd swallowed since that night was finally breathing. She placed the book back on the shelf and turned toward me. You know this isn't simple, she said. I know. And you know people wouldn't understand. I'm not sure I do either, I admitted. But when I see you, everything else feels quieter. For a moment, she looked away, at the window, at the street outside, anywhere but me. Then she said softly, You make it hard to forget who I was before I became someone's mother, someone's responsibility. I stepped closer, just enough for her to hear my voice clearly. Maybe that's the point, I said. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. The distance between us was smaller than it had ever been, and somehow, it felt like the most intimate thing in the world. The bell above the bookstore door chimed as someone walked in, breaking the spell. She smiled faintly, glancing toward the sound. I should go, she whispered. Yeah, I said softly. Me too. But as she passed, her hand brushed against mine, not by accident, not anymore. That single touch said everything neither of us had the courage to speak. She called me the following week. Her voice was calm, composed, but underneath, there was a softness I hadn't heard before. I heard you're leaving town, she said. Just for a while, I replied. A new project. Out near the coast. A pause. When? Tomorrow. Another silence, long enough to say what neither of us dared. Then, almost hesitantly, she said, Would you stop by before you go? I told her I would. And I did. The next evening, the world seemed unreasonably still. The air held that gentle coolness between seasons, not yet summer, not quite spring. The sun was low when I reached her house, filtering through the garden like liquid gold. She was there, waiting by the gate. No tea this time, no quiet excuse for company. Just her, standing among the pale blossoms she'd planted months ago. "You're early," she said, smiling faintly. "You always say that. I suppose I just never expect people to keep their word anymore." There was no edge in her tone, just truth. That simple, beautiful honesty I'd come to know so well. We walked slowly through the garden, past the rows of flowers bending under the weight of the wind. It felt like a scene from another life, one where time moved slower, where nothing needed to be explained. When we stopped beneath the old tree, she turned toward me. Her eyes, steady, unguarded, held mine as if memorizing every detail. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. "I didn't want to leave without seeing you." "Then don't," she whispered. For a heartbeat, everything inside me wanted to stay, to forget reason, timing, rules. To close the space between us and let the silence finally break. But some part of me, the older, quieter part, knew that love doesn't always mean staying. "I wish things were different," I said. She smiled, shaking her head. "You always think too much." "Maybe," I admitted. "But I don't want to forget this. Any of it." She reached out then, her fingers brushing the sleeve of my jacket, the gentlest touch, the kind that says more than a kiss ever could. "You won't," she said. "Neither will I." The wind rustled through the leaves, scattering petals around us. It looked almost staged, like the world itself was giving us permission to let go beautifully. She took a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "You meant it, didn't you?" I nodded. Every glance. Every word. She smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't sad. Just peaceful. "Then that's enough." I walked away before I could change my mind, each step heavier than the last. But as I reached the gate, I turned back, and there she was, standing in the fading light, her hand resting on the garden fence. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just looked at me, the same way she had that first day, and somehow, that was goodbye. The kind that doesn't end things. The kind that stays. Every story like this means something different to each of us. Drop a comment, where are you watching from, and what do you think he should have done?